we were flying, I think it was to Santiago. The president was going to give a big foreign policy speech. We'd been working on it for weeks and, done all the usual negotiation with other policy experts. We're getting ready to fly into Santiago, and the president, we're on Air Force One. The president walks back. He's got the speech in his hand. So I think, okay, we're pretty much done. And he looks at me and he said, this is a good 6-page speech. And I'm thinking, great, we're done. We're all finished. And he goes, it would be a great 5-page speech. So I'm thinking, okay, well, he said, why don't you see if you can shave a page off this speech? And I'm thinking, this is insane. We've got about an hour or two to go before the speech. We've been working on this for weeks, and all of a sudden we're going to cut a page off of a 6-page. So I figure he must have recommended what to cut. He hadn't provided a single edit. He had edited previous rounds, but at this point he's like, not a single suggestion on what should be cut. He just felt it was too long and said, hey, basically saying, you're the speechwriter, you fix it. So it was chaos. Like for the next hour or two, just the plane's landing, the plane's shaking, and we're tapping away, trying, cutting and slashing, all this language that we had carefully negotiated with our policy experts, just gutting it, but we did it. We shaved a page off of a 6-page speech. He went and gave the speech that afternoon, and guess what? It was fine. Nobody screamed. Nobody complained. Oh my God, you took out the things that we thought were so important. Well, one page off of a 6-page speech is about 15%.
Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
First of all, I want to tell you a couple of things about your book. One is, apart from saying that it's a fantastic book, now in your book, you say that before working as a speechwriter, you hadn't read any book on public speaking. I've read many books as a public speaking coach. I've read so many books, and yours is definitely one of the best books, if not the best book I've ever read on the subject. And also,
thank you.
It's a very unique book. In your book, Terry, you say that when you give a speech, you have to give the speech that only you can give. And I think that this book here, by the way, for everyone, say it well, this book, only you could have written this book. And I can say it. So that's one thing. And also, I don't know why and how it happened, but reading your book, it made me cry a few times. I don't know whether other people told you, but I cried on a few occasions because in addition to sharing your experiences with President Barack Obama, but also there are so many other examples of powerful speeches and talks. And I don't know about you, Terry, but for me, the main reason why I do what I do is because if someone has something to share, an idea, especially if that idea is a good idea, and even better, if it's an idea that has the power to change the world, to make the world a little place, and it could be in our own little world sometimes, if you can say it well, if you can share the idea in an effective way, that's so powerful. So yeah, thank you very much for writing it.
I appreciate that. No, yeah, people, I appreciate that. I think one of the parts of the book that really resonating with people is, again, as you said, this isn't just a book about, what I learned from a president who's considered one of the greatest sort of speakers and orators of modern times, but I want people to know that we don't have to be a president to do these things, or a prime minister, or a government leader or a business leader. We can all bring our authentic voices to the causes and the concerns and the companies that we care about. And so, yeah, so many of the stories in the book are just ordinary folks like all of us, business leaders, people in their communities, young people who found the courage to stand up and speak up for what they believe in. And I think that those are, I suspect those are probably the stories that you're talking about. They're moving because, so many of us, one of the reasons I wrote this book is every once in a while someone speaks up and their speech goes viral, and we thank them for having the courage to speak up, and they inspire us. And imagine how many people don't have the courage to speak up, how many voices we're not hearing, how many voices we're not hearing. That's why I wrote this book. I want everybody to know that wherever you come from, whoever you are, whatever your circumstances, you have something to say, and the world is waiting to hear it. So I hope this book, when people read it, They put it down and they think, yeah, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to do this. I'm going to stand up, with my family, in my neighborhood, in my community, my company, my town, my country. We need to be hearing everybody, especially now.
Love it. And as I said at the beginning, I guess before we got started, I found it very interesting that you said in the book that before starting to work as a speechwriter, if I understood well, if I remember well, you had never read a book on public speaking. So just out of curiosity, Terry, how did you get into this line of work,
Sure.
working as a speechwriter?
But I probably should have read a book about public speaking or rhetoric or so. It would have made it a lot easier, I think. But so, I mean, I had always been interested in government and politics, history growing up. I was fascinated by politics. I came to college and university in Washington, D.C. because I wanted to be where the action is. My senior year, my final year, I was given an incredible opportunity. I was an intern at the White House, and I was assigned to the Speechwriters Office. This was President Bill Clinton at the time, and I was assigned to his foreign policy speechwriters. And as an intern, you're mostly you're doing grunt work. You're getting coffee, you're getting lunch, you're doing research. But every once in a while, they let me take a crack at something. And so for the first time in my life, I was 22 years old, helping an American president once in a while communicate America's vision and values to the rest of the world. And what an incredible way to serve your country, to contribute. And so I didn't really have an interest in being, spending my days and hours every day in these sort of intricate policy meetings. But I love the idea of basically helping write the music for an administration, for a presidency, the poetry, and hopefully inspiring people. And so that's how I got my start.
That's how it happened. And there's another thing that I found very curious. If I understood well, on some occasions, or maybe on many occasions, I don't know, the speech that you and your colleagues prepared for or with President Barack Obama, that happened sometimes. The final speech was ready maybe the day before the event. I think you give an example of the speech that Barack Obama gave when he accepted the Nobel Prize. And I think you mentioned that there was the speech was done the day before. You mentioned maybe another example where Obama kept making changes up until just a few hours before
Right,
the speech, or maybe a few minutes before the speech.
right.
Just so I
Very
know,
common.
so that was very common.
That's right. That's right. Well, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and again, what I do in sharing these stories, what I try to do is, here's how Barack Obama did it, and he did it his way. But here's the lesson that we can take away from that. Here's what we can do in our own lives, whether we're in business and government, politics, community, what have you. And what he was doing was, he was using the amount of time that he had. If we had a day or two to keep making it better, he wanted to keep making it better. And I, as a speechwriter, always would drive me a little crazy because, well, it was done a day ago. You liked it a day ago. Why not just leave it as is? And as he often said to us, I could give this today, which meant he didn't want to give it today. He said, we have 3 days. Let's make it better. Let's use those 3 days to make it better. So, one of the lessons of the book is that we should use whatever amount of time we have, we should be using it wisely. And now I'm not recommending that you completely rewrite your speech or presentation an hour before, but constantly looking at it. Can you make it tighter? Can you make it smoother? Can you make it more readable? Is it clear? How can you tighten it up? And he would do that. He would do that right up until the very end, the last few minutes. I mean, it could be nerve wracking, and I don't always recommend that people do that. But I do believe in always going back and looking how can I make this better.
Yeah, because when you try and constantly make it better until the very last moment, then my concern is that yes, you make it better from a content perspective, which is the most important thing, and you also talk about it in the book, and I agree with you. But then you also need to get to a point where you practice the speech, you rehearse it, and so if you until the very last minute, if you make it better from a content perspective, then as I was reading the book, I was thinking, how did he go about then making sure that he was ready to deliver the content that he was making better.
Good. Well, in the case of Barack Obama, I mean, he by the time he became president, he was a pretty good public speaker. He most of the time he didn't need to rehearse and practice his speeches. Now he did for certain big ones, you know, the State of the Union address that we have here every year. They would set up a teleprompter and he would practice that. For the rest of us, yes, I actually have a rule in the book that I talk about. It's called the 50-25-25 rule, and it's basically no matter how much time you have to get ready for a presentation, whether it's a month, a few weeks, 1 week, a few days, a few hours, I just generally recommend use the 50% of your time to think, to outline, to research. Use maybe 25% of your time to write, and set aside 25% of your time to practice. I think what's a big mistake that a lot of folks make is, we kind of keep writing and rewriting until the very last minute. We don't build in that time to practice, and that's where you really get comfortable with your script. I have to say, that doesn't mean you stop editing. In fact, once you start reading it out loud, remember, speeches, presentations, these are auditory experiences. They're meant to be heard, not simply to be read. They're meant to be experienced. And so as you practice and you realize you're stumbling over certain words or you're finding it hard to deliver certain lines, that's a cue to you to go back and rewrite it in a way that's more natural to you. And so even when you're practicing, you're still editing, you're still making it better once you hear it. And having your colleagues, if your team, your advisors around you listening, and hopefully empowered to give you honest feedback if you're not delivering it well. Building in that 25% or so of your time, it's okay. You can go back and you can redo it. You've accounted for that.
And the 50-25-25 rule is very much connected to a very important concept that you talk about in the book, which is that the best predictor of whether you'll do well at the podium, and it doesn't have to be a podium, it could be on stage, it is not what you do at the podium, but is the preparation that goes into the talk before the podium. That's such an important concept. And also, Terry, there's another reason why I like your book so much. And in a way, we started talking about it. We mentioned it briefly, but I would love for you to expand. You say, and I agree with you 100%, that what you say in a speech, in a presentation, is far more important than how you say it. And I think we need to talk about that, because I'm a public speaking coach, and so many people in our world, so many public speaking coaches, I think, pay too much attention to how we say, how we communicate our ideas, things like body language, gestures, voice, and eye contact. I'm not saying that these things are not important. They can be very effective to help you amplify your message, but what you say is the most important thing. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly, and I talk about this in the book. Stipulation right up front. I'm not saying that body language doesn't matter. Of course it matters. I'm not saying that your hand gestures and how you stand don't matter. Of course, if you're not dynamic at the podium, if you slouch, if you don't use your hands, if you don't smile, I mean, all these things are important, and I talk about them in the book. But absolutely, I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of speakers and leaders in business and elsewhere make is focusing so much on all of that they forget that the primary purpose of the presentation is to deliver a message, a clear, compelling, coherent message. And before you do any of that body language work and how to stand, you've got to get your message right. And you've got to make sure you're saying something of consequence. I mean, we've all heard presentations where the person, they're dynamic, they move about the stage, they're clearly passionate, they're smiling, I mean, they're dynamic, but they're not saying anything. It's cliches, it's empty, it's hollow. And so a big focus of the book is on making sure we're saying things that are substantive, that are coherent, that are compelling, that you're speaking from your heart, you're saying the things that only you can say, you're delivering unique, compelling messages that only you can deliver. Number two, that you're truly connecting with your audience and that you're not going around just giving the same presentation all the time to every different audience, that you're thinking deeply about the mood and the values and the interests and the goals and the feelings of your audience, so that you can really speak to them. Yeah, I think so. The book is structured in a way chronologically. I've tried to do it to guide people through all the steps of creating a great speech or presentation from beginning to end. And so, sort of the front half of the book is about getting these messages right, and how all the different ways that we can connect with an audience and create this experience, this communal moment, this communal experience between a speaker and an audience. And my bottom line is that body language will never save a bad speech. In the end, you're going to be judged for whether your message is compelling, coherent, inspiring, motivating, and people will give you a break if your body language isn't perfect. But body language will never save a bad speech, a bad presentation. So that's why I think sometimes the emphasis is just a little bit misplaced. Again, not to say it doesn't matter, but I wish folks would spend much more time making sure they get their message right.
We are very much aligned from that perspective. And so we said that the most important thing is to be able to prepare and communicate a compelling message. And you suggest that one of the key steps to get to that point at the beginning is you need to know your 10 words. Now, for those who haven't read the book, can you tell me more about these 10 words? What are they, and why is it important?
Sure. But one of the things that whenever we would meet with President Obama before a big speech, he'd often ask us, or sort of ask rhetorically of himself, what's the story we're trying to tell here in the speech? And he wasn't looking for a 10-minute explanation about what the speech was about. He was really trying to get us and get himself to boil it down, to one sentence or so. And this is something I do with all the clients I work with. It's something I recommend in the book that everybody do before you ever try to write out your presentation, produce your slide deck. Before any of that, before you go down these rabbit holes and days and weeks of preparation, what in one sentence or less do you want the audience to remember about this? And another way to think about it is, if you could write the headline, the news story about your presentation, just as so many organizations and companies, you write a press release, what would that headline be? Headlines in a newspaper, press release, these are short, they're tight, maybe 10 words or less. And so I encourage people to boil down that 10-word message and not just think about it, but write it down and print it out maybe even. Sometimes when I'm working on a presentation, I will write out the 10 words, print it out, tape it on the wall next to my computer. And as I'm working on that presentation over hours, days, weeks, I'm checking in. If you find yourself creating content or writing something that has nothing to do with those 10 words, you've gone on a detour, a dangerous detour. You've lost the thread. You've digressed. So it's a great way of keeping yourself focused and really being sharp, and also show it to other people. If it's a cliche, if it's vapid, if it's empty, if it's hollow, it's not a very compelling message. So I just think this is one of those exercises, one of those things we can do in that first 50% of our time, again, before we ever write a single word. And it's a forcing mechanism. It forces you to think with precision about what you want the audience to remember. The audience is not going to remember 10 or 15 different things about your presentation, but they can remember a few, they can remember one. Identify that one up front and you'll be a more effective communicator.
You encourage people to do that, to know that 10 words. You also encourage people, and you do say in the book that these perhaps doesn't apply all the time, but you say that in most cases, you should write your speech word for word. Now, in my experience, working with clients, there are some people who love writing it out word for word. Other people prefer to have some talking points, some bullet points, but you say that in most cases you should write it out word for word. Tell me more about these suggestions that you gave from your perspective.
Sure. No, like I just say, it depends on every situation, and but I think there's a lot of value in writing it out. Writing it out forces you to think deeply about what you want to say. Writing it out helps you see the structure in your argument and whether it actually works. Writing it out helps you see the strengths and weaknesses in your argument, in your logic pattern, whether, how many points do you actually have in your presentation? Is it 3 or is it 6? Sometimes if you don't write it out, you don't see it. Or then until you write it out, you don't realize, wow, point 3 is really the same as point 5. When I talk it out, they sound different. But now that I see it on the page, they're actually quite similar. Writing it out helps you make decisions if you lead an organization. There might be different people within your organizations who have different objectives. If you're a leader in that organization, writing it down shows and forces your team to understand what your priorities are. Writing it down can help you make a decision. I tell the story in the book of a general who had made some disparaging remarks about the president and the vice president, and President Obama had to decide what to do. And he had our speechwriting team, not me, but somebody else, write 2 different speeches. One was keeping the general, and one was letting the general go. It was a way of the president helping to see the arguments on both sides of the case. And once he saw both cases written down, it helped him make his decision. So there's a lot. And again, writing it down helps us practice. If you haven't written it down, it's really hard to go in and practice multiple times. You find yourself saying something different every single time. Also, writing it down is a great safety net, because no matter how many speeches we've done, how good we think we are, there are always moments when even the most experienced speaker will freeze up. It happens, they lose their train of thought. How many times have we been in an audience where we hear a speaker say, "Oh, I digress," or "So sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second." Having it written down, whether a full script or an outline, lets you quickly recover. So it's important. So yeah, even if you don't plan on delivering your speech or your presentation word for word, I think there's tremendous value as an individual and as an organization in writing it down and thinking it through. You can always turn it into bullet points later, but I guarantee you, writing it down, thinking it through, planning it out will always make you a better, more effective communicator.
And I'd love to explore even more practical tips, because your book includes so many practical tips for anyone who wants to become a better speaker, a better communicator. For example, you mentioned that you structure your book into some key parts, and it is true, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And talking about the beginning, so how to start a presentation, for example. At the beginning, we want to be able to grab the audience's attention, and you give some practical things we can do to do that. One is interesting. It's very simple. You just say hello. One way to grab the audience's attention is to just say hello, and then you also point to a video where Obama does that, also using the language of the audience. Tell me more about these tactic, if you want. Just say hello at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no one way to start any presentation. It depends on the speaker, the audience, the mood, the moment, the tone, what you're there to do. So in that chapter, the whole chapter is of all the different ways that you can start a speech. And people, as they read, I hope that they think of the ones that will work for them given the moment. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make is they just get up and they treat that opening 30 seconds to 60 seconds as sort of a necessary evil. Oh, I've got to acknowledge people. I've got to thank the people who've introduced me or hosting me, or how nice it is to be there. And you should do all those things at some point. But really, I think that doesn't mean it has to be the very first words out of your mouth. And those first, 10, 30, 60 seconds is your first and one of your best opportunities to just really connect emotionally with your audience. And that means something, if the situation lends itself to it, something that's high energy, that's exciting, that gets you smiling, that gets the audience smiling. I mean, one of the reasons you say hello with enthusiasm is the key, not just, get up there and say, hello, it's great to be here today. That's not going to work. But something that really hello, good morning, good afternoon, excitement, show energy. Sometimes I write on the top of the script that I have for my clients, big giant letters, smile. I'm amazed at how many people forget to smile. It's one of the simplest things we can do. It sends a powerful signal to your audience that you're a friend, that you're here to connect. so again, there's so many different ways to do it, but I think underlying so many of them are your enthusiasm, your joy in being there, your energy level, and then you can get into thanking the people, but also thanking them from your heart, not just a long litany of list of acknowledgments and titles, but I'm a big believer in using acknowledgments to really tap the spirit of the event. If you're there to celebrate a company, don't just list their names, commend them for the work they do, celebrate the work they do. Those are good acknowledgments. But yeah, the whole chapter is full of all sorts of different ways, starting with a story, the pros and cons of humor and jokes and that sort of thing. But I think the best thing you can do is smile
Yeah.
and
And
greet your audience in some way.
you've just said now starting with the story is another way, and it doesn't have to be at the beginning, but if we think about storytelling in general, there's another great tip that you give, which is telling the story of a single person. And for example, you give the example of Omran during the Syria refugee crisis, and you explain that we are much more likely to have empathy for a specific person rather than for a large group of people. So can you, for those who haven't read the book, can you tell us about this idea of telling the story of a single person?
Right. So this is rooted in psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but it's something I've been doing for a long time, and turns out there's science to back it up. All sorts of research to show that if you're describing a situation, a problem, a crisis, what have you, you want people to volunteer, donate, care, work, whatever. We all have a tendency, and I've done it many times too, is well, I want people to understand how big the problem is. So you paint the picture of just a massive problem, thousands of people suffering, millions of people suffering. And research has shown over and over again, that can have kind of a numbing effect. They call it psychic numbing. When you make the problem so big, people think, well, why should I donate? Why should I work? My $5, my $20, my $100 is clearly not going to save a million people. So they just you create this sort of mismatch in people's mind. But when you tell the story of one person, people can relate to that. Charities are phenomenal. We have the St. Jude Cancer Hospital here in the United States. They're renowned for their marketing and their commercials. They tell an emotional, powerful story of one child, and it breaks your heart, and you want to help that one child. Now, they don't hit you over the head with lots of numbers and statistics about how many kids are suffering from childhood cancer, because that would just overwhelm you, and people wouldn't give. And so I tell this, and I share these stories in the book because I want people to know whatever kind of work you do, whether it's business, nonprofit, philanthropy, what have you, you should be great leaders are great storytellers. You should be out there, not throwing a lot of numbers at your audience, but pick a story about a customer, an employee, a client, someone you've helped, a difference you've made, and tell that story. Make the audience care about that. You'll find that it's a much more compelling presentation, and you're more likely to get the results you want. Again, whether you're recruiting someone to work at your company, or whether you're trying to get the employees that you already have to work harder, or you're trying to get a company to partner with you or to sign a deal with you. Don't just throw a lot of numbers out. Get human. Tell a human story. Show the difference that you actually make in people's lives.
Before we continue with this episode, I just want to share a few resources that I think will be super useful for you. The first one is check out either my book, Confident Presenter, or my colleague Phil Wakenall's book, Business Presentation Revolution, or both. These are books for business owners and leaders who want to take their presentation skills to a higher level. To make the most of the books, take the Confident Presenter Scorecard, which is an online tool that allows you to assess your presentation skills for free in less than 3 minutes. And then also, at the moment, I'm running a series of free presentation skills web classes, and I'd love to see you there. The links are in the show notes. Now, let's go back to the episode. I'd love for you, Terry, if you don't mind, to go a little bit deeper on this thing, because you do talk about in the book that a very common mistake is that people tend to think that if they need to convince somebody of something, then they have to share lots of facts and data, numbers, statistics. You also mentioned Tali Sharot, and I know Tali Sharot for her
Oh,
work. I also asked her to appear on the show. It hasn't happened yet, maybe one day. And so again, for our listeners, it would be super important if you could just talk a little bit more about this idea of just being careful, thinking that if we want to convince somebody of something, all we need to do is just share facts and figures.
right. Well, I think, I understand why we all do it. I mean, I've done it at times, and we all like to think that, we're logical and factual, we're data-based, we're evidence-based. We make decisions based on facts and figures and numbers and logic. And I'm not trying to say that logic is not important, but what I ask folks, think of your most deeply held beliefs, the things you care most about, or the things you've chosen to dedicate your life to. Was it because someone gave you a fact or figure or statistic? Chances are it's not. People don't sign up for the military because they've heard an interesting statistic. They don't dedicate their life to a cause because of a statistic or a number. They don't, donate lots of money because to help people who are suffering because of a number. They do it because someone's story has resonated with them. You've told them an inspiring story. And again, there's all sorts of research that I talk about in the book where oftentimes the more numbers you throw at someone, the more overwhelmed they get. It can actually be counterproductive. There's one study I talk about in the book where they brought a group of parents together who were skeptical of vaccines. They didn't want to vaccinate their children against diseases, illnesses. And so they just sort of bombarded them with all sorts of numbers and information about statistics. And all it did in the end, I mean, because when they say, these are 98% effective. Well, the person who's skeptical is going to the 2% number. All of a sudden, these people in this particular study that I cite in the book, they ended up more skeptical of vaccines. And we had this experience at the White House with President Obama. We were there during the Ebola outbreak. It was absolute sort of hysteria in the United States at the time. I think 2 or 3 people had contracted it in the United States, and the president would go out there and talk about talk about the statistics, and didn't really do much to like assure people. And there's this great quote that I came across from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Right? He's like, you can't change someone's mind with logic when they haven't reached that conclusion by logic in the first place. And so again, what you're left with, okay, so if bombarding people with numbers doesn't work, the only thing left is powerful stories that move them and that change their framework about how they see a problem. So yeah, there's a whole chapter about this. And I look back, I think some of this I've only learned since working at the White House, and I wish I had known some of this before. I think I would have approached some of the speeches that I worked on differently, and maybe not included so many numbers. But I think it's a skill. This is something that I think it's a mistake that a lot of people make. But again, I keep coming back to, in your own life, whatever it is you care about, there's probably no number that's going to get you to change your mind. So why do we think that that's what's going to work for someone else?
By the way, you mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't know what you think. I think he's a fantastic communicator. When you communicate science, especially science, it's hard stuff. It's not easy at all. And he's got these ability, which comes with practice, because it's not,
Right.
I don't believe in natural talent. I know that he works a lot at this thing, but he's able to communicate complex topics while making them accessible to everyone, especially known experts, known scientists like me. And this is very much connected to another mistake that many people make, and you do talk about in the book, which is that often people use complex language, jargon, industry-specific terms, acronyms, because they think that if they do that, then they sound smarter and more credible. And what's
Right.
interesting is that you say that what happens is the opposite. Jargon, you say, can undermine your credibility. And so there's a whole chapter, which is super useful chapter, where you say you need to talk like a human. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, what a crazy idea. We should talk like a human. Yeah, no, I think this is true. This is true everywhere: business, government, philanthropy, charity. every sector, industry, every company seems to have sort of its own vocabulary that's risen up around it. And I think there's all sorts of reasons that people do this. I think you pointed to one that people think it makes them sound smart and informed and knowledgeable. I think it's also in many cases it's as well, I don't know whether this explicit or implicit, but it's a way of kind of keeping others out. It's a way of kind of preserving your sector for those who know the vocabulary. So it's exclusionary rather than being what communication should be, which is inclusive and bringing people to your ideas. So right, it goes back to the famous curse of knowledge, right? When a lot of folks forget that not everyone in your audience has the knowledge or vocabulary that you have. And when you make assumptions about that, you're going to leave some of your audiences in the dark. Again, whether it's acronyms or jargon or bureaucraties or, I give a lot of examples of this. Yeah, I had a client once who said to me, well, if 90% of my audience understands me, I'm okay with that. They didn't want to kind of, in their mind, dumb it down for the other 10%. And I thought, like, no, this is actually not good, because, in that 10% of the audience that doesn't understand what you said could be your next donor, your next investor, your next partner, your next customer, your next client. And if they don't understand what you're saying, they're not going to team up with you. They're not going to align with you. They're not going to buy your product. They're not going to join your organization. So you're leaving 10% on the floor. Why would you do that? You should be striving for 100%. And so in the book, I share a lot of different ways that we can check ourselves and make sure that we are communicating so that the widest possible number of people can hear it. We worked on State of the Unions at the White House, and there are universities that often, after the fact, they grade State of the Union speeches. And they have found that many State of the Union speeches are written at about the 8th grade level in the United States. And, we never did that deliberately. We never sat there and go, well, this sentence is at the 11th grade level, we need to reduce it. But we were trying to, I'm not surprised to hear that, because we were trying to make it accessible to as many people as possible. And for better or worse, the sort of average reading level in the United States is around the 8th grade level. So you're writing for the most possible people. And now, the first thing I get when people hear this is, well, what about if you're giving a technical presentation to a technical audience? Of course, like you're an engineer to a conference of engineers, and they're expecting technical. Of course, absolutely. I'm not suggesting that you de-tech your speech, but I will say this: I still think there is a mistake that a lot of folks made when they think that the audience only wants to hear the technical. And I give examples in the book of this as well. Just because you're speaking to a technical audience of experts doesn't mean you can't still tell powerful stories about your work. All communicators can be great storytellers. And again, we've all sat through, those of us if you've gone to a conference, and still a lot of boring speeches at these you wish that person had been a more dynamic speaker, had told more stories about the work, and not simply delivered, the equivalent of a verbal white paper. People don't want that.
And I think in that scenario, Terry, another thing that many people in any audience often wish is that the presentation was a little bit shorter.
That's right.
And you talk about the importance of brevity. For example, you give a great tip. You say, once you've created your speech, go back to it and try to cut 15%. Again,
that's right.
Tell me more.
Sure. So this is actually rooted in a kind of a funny story. We were flying, I think it was to Santiago. The president was going to give a big foreign policy speech. We'd been working on it for weeks, and done all the usual negotiation with other policy experts. We're getting ready to fly into Santiago, and the president, we're on Air Force One. The president walks back. He's got the speech in his hand. So I think, okay, we're pretty much done. And he looks at me and he said, this is a good 6-page speech. And I'm thinking, great, we're done. We're all finished. And he goes, it would be a great 5-page speech. So I'm thinking, okay, well, he said, why don't you see if you can shave a page off this speech? And I'm thinking, this is insane. We've got about an hour or two to go before the speech. We've been working on this for weeks, and all of a sudden we're going to cut a page off of a 6-page. So I figure he must have recommended what to cut. He hadn't provided a single edit. He had edited previous rounds, but at this point he's like, not a single suggestion on what should be cut. He just felt it was too long. and said, hey, basically saying, you're the speechwriter, you fix it. So it was chaos. Like for the next hour or two, just the plane's landing, the plane's shaking, and we're tapping away, trying, cutting and slashing, all this language that we had carefully negotiated with our policy experts, just gutting it, but we did it. We shaved a page off of a 6-page speech. He went and gave the speech that afternoon, and guess what? It was fine. Nobody screamed. Nobody complained. Oh my God, you took out the things that we thought were so important. Well, one page off of a 6-page speech is about 15%. And he was right. It was a tighter speech, a better speech, a more compelling speech. He did this to us a lot. In the final hours or even minutes before a speech, we'd be sitting backstage and he'd just be saying, hey, let's see if we can cut a few paragraphs off this speech. And I'm thinking, this was, as a speechwriter, this is terrifying. Like, again, we're minutes away and we're cutting back. What he was forcing us to do was to think deeply about the difference between what's nice to have in a speech or a presentation and what's necessary. And if you are there's a lot of things that are nice to have in a speech, but they're really not necessary. So, the lesson is, you're making a slide deck and you have 100 slides, or you have a 30-minute presentation or a 10-minute toast or what have you, all the different ways we speak. You think you're done, again, because you've built in 25% of your time to practice and make it better. Put it down, come back to it a few hours later or maybe a day later and just cut 15%. Or ask a colleague to cut 15%, or your partner, your spouse, cut 15%. You can always do it. It's amazing. And in the rare occasion when you can't, you can maybe still cut 10%. You'll end up cutting more than you thought possible. It'll always be better. It'll always be tighter.
Yeah, in general, I believe that if you can say something in 30 minutes, if you can say exactly the same thing in 15 minutes or 20 minutes, the 20-minute version will always be better, more effective, more concise than the 30-minute version.
That's right.
And there are also a couple of other ideas very, very useful in the book. One is that you say that sometimes your clients tell you, maybe it's a CEO, and they say, look, I have to talk about the features and benefits of my product. That's what my audience wants to hear.
Right.
And you say, that's fine. Yeah, of course, talk about the features and benefits of your product or your service, but don't forget to wrap that around a bigger idea. And
Right.
I'd love for you to share that.
Yeah, again, I think this is one of the sort of biggest challenges and mistakes that a lot of business leaders face. They think the audience only wants to hear about the product, the services, the service, the benefits, the features. And yes, they do want to hear about that. You must show why your company or service or product is better than the competition and why they should choose you. I think the mistake is that thinking that's the only thing they want to hear. And it's not just that. And sometimes there aren't that many profound differences between a particular product or service. I mean, they could go either way. So that's when you have an opportunity to really tell a bigger, more profound story, to speak to the values of your company or the values of your product or the kind of world you're trying to build, or to tell stories, again, about why you do the work you do. So many, think of all the products you buy or the services that you buy, why you choose to shop at one store versus another, or why you buy from one person versus someone else. It's because you believe in that person, you believe in their values, you believe in what they're trying to do, you believe in what that company stands for, and you want to support companies that do good as you see good. I love the sign behind you. Let your voice be a force for good, but let your company be a voice for good. Let your organization bring your product and your service alive with stories. And again, the story can be the story of why you do what you do. It can be powerful stories of the difference that your product makes in the lives of people or your organization. So I think great business leaders, great communicators, again, I'll keep saying, are great storytellers. And so if you're not out there telling stories, you're missing opportunities. You're leaving money on the table. And so yeah, I think that it's not just about the product. It's about the value system. It's about the feeling that you give your audience. And we've seen this over and over again. Market research will there's so much evidence out there that people gravitate towards, companies and leaders and products that they feel kind of reflect their value system.
I found, thanks to your book, I found an example which I was not aware of, and maybe it was a massive thing, but I wasn't aware of it. I just missed it. The Patagonia Black Friday campaign, "Don't buy this shirt" or something along those lines. That was super interesting, and no, but it's true. I think it can be so powerful to just step back and think about when you think about your company, your product, your service. Also think about, why do we do what we do? Why do we have this product? Why do we offer this service? Why do we wake up in the morning? Beyond, of course, profit, beyond money. And if when we find the answer to that question, that can be super powerful for ourselves, for the team, externally, because then we need to be able to communicate it. I agree. And there's another idea that you talk about, which I think is perhaps one of the most important ones. And you say that you need to frame your idea around the values and arguments that make sense to them, to the audience, not to us.
Right.
Often, maybe we're not aware of it, but we frame our ideas around the values and the arguments, the things that make sense to us as
Right.
speakers. Tell me more about this, Terry.
Yeah, no, I think, again, whether we're in politics or business or philanthropy or charity, we know why we care. We know what motivates us, and we know why we do the work that we do, or at least we should. And so we develop stump speeches. We develop 2 or 3 or 4 kind of core messages, and we just travel around and we kind of give the same presentation to everybody. It might tweak it a little bit, and I think that's a mistake. And obviously, I do encourage people to have kind of a core stable of presentations. You can't reinvent the wheel every single day. But a big mistake that I think a lot of speakers make is they fail to think deeply about the values of their audience, right? So knowing your audience is one of the most basic fundamental principles of communication, public speaking. We all know that. But to me, that's really, 10 different questions. All the things we should be thinking about. This audience, what's their history? What's their background? What have they gone through? Have they come off a recent success? Have they come off a recent loss? What's their mood? What's their value system? What motivates you? And one of the things I do whenever I help a client or with a speech is I go to the host organization's website, and I read some of the speeches or listen to some of the speeches of that leader, or look at the core values of that organization. That'll tell you a lot about who they are and what they value. Make sure you're speaking to that, making sure you're speaking to their experiences, their perspective, their worldview, their feelings, what they've gone through, their mood. Are they afraid? Are they optimistic? Are they energized? Are they demoralized? Great speakers really speak to all of that, and that takes a lot of work sometimes, but it will always lead to a better presentation. And one of the things I think that one of the best compliments you can get as a communicator and as a speaker is when someone in the audience after the fact says, not just that person spoke to me, but that they spoke for me, that you somehow channeled what that person was feeling. They felt seen, they felt heard. This is something that after I heard so many times after speeches for President Obama. I would love to go up to an audience member. They didn't know who I was. They maybe thought I was a journalist or somebody. But I'd go up and ask, what'd you think of that speech? Was there a particular part? And it was never any one particular sentence. It was some version of, I felt he heard me, he saw me, and he spoke for me. What a wonderful thing to be able to do as a speaker. But you can only do that if you spend a lot of time thinking about really who is my audience, what do they feel, what do they value, what do they want, what do they need in that moment. If you can speak to all of that, you're more likely to get the results you want, right, from your audience. There's no point in giving any sort of presentation unless you want your audience to do something, and that's another great measure of a speech. People always ask me, how do you know if the speech worked? Well, it works if the audience does what you want them to do. So it's either think differently, act differently, work harder, donate, volunteer, whatever it is you're asking them to do. If a few days, few weeks, few months later, they're behaving and thinking and acting the same way they were before your presentation. It wasn't a very good presentation. They don't remember it. It hasn't changed anything. They're just words. But the words become deeds, and that's another chapter in the book. The words become deeds when you actually get your audience to actually do the things that you want them to do.
Yeah,
That's the measure of a great speaker and a great communicator.
it's never just about sharing some information. If that's the objective, that can be the objective sometimes, but then if that's the only objective, that there's no need to give a speech or representation.
That's right.
We want the audience to believe something new or different, to think, to feel something new or different, to do something new or different. And we started by thinking about how to grab the audience's attention, for example, say hello and many other tactics. It's very interesting that there's a chapter towards the end of your book, and you say there's only one way to end a speech, and you need to end with hope.
That's right.
Tell me more.
Sure. So now that's kind of a joke with the title there. I mean, obviously there's no one way there's lots of different ways you can end the speech, in the sense that, you might tell a story, you might end with a to-do list, a call to action, and I lay all that out, but just underlying all of that, there's really only one sentiment, one feeling that I think, and that is hope. So again, it goes back to think about why you're standing up and giving any sort of presentation. It's because you want the audience to do something differently, believe something different, act differently. And there is no point in doing that unless you can actually leave them with a sense of hope and optimism that it can be achieved. I mean, if you're a CEO and you have a terrible earnings quarter, terrible quarter, you can't just say, well, that was a terrible quarter, and I don't know if this company's going to succeed. I mean, that company goes out of business pretty quick. People start sending off their resumes. So no matter who you are, no matter what you're talking about, no matter who your audience is, you've got to leave them with a sense of hope that whatever it is you're talking about is achievable. And there's that. You mentioned Terry Szuplat. She has spent, as have other researchers, years studying how people think about the future, and they've found over and over again that we tend to overestimate the likelihood of good things happening in our life and our work, and then we underestimate the likelihood of bad things happening. And she and others call it the optimism bias. And something like, according to their research, like 80% of the people around the world have this bias towards optimism. And we certainly know, all of us, and people in our lives who don't have it, who always see the glass as half full. But the reason I mention that, and I mention it in the book, is because I love this idea. She has this beautiful phrase. She talked about the result of this research. She believes that so many of us are hardwired for hope. And I think I say that because this gives us a superpower as communicators. Because if you accept the fact that most people are hardwired for hope, they want to believe that the problem can be solved. They want to believe that the disease can be cured, that the problem can be fixed, the war can be stopped, the suffering can be alleviated. We want to believe that, and we're willing to do the work to make it happen. That's our job as a speaker. Great leaders, great speakers end their presentations with hope and optimism that the reason we're here today, it's actually achievable. We can do this. And so again, I think this is one of the most powerful things we can do as a leader. And I share a lot of the science behind hope. It's not feel good. It's not mushy. There's science behind this. And I think when you think of all the great leaders in business and politics and throughout history, they all do this in one way or another. And we can do it too.
And that part of the book, Terry, was very reassuring for me, because unfortunately in the world, we often see the opposite. People communicating on I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly now, but not on the side of hope, but on the side of the opposite. Fear. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
it's called fear mongering. And one of the things I say in the book is, you can be a fear monger or you can be a hope monger. We all get to decide which one we're going to be. And we can't control what the politicians and the leaders say. I mean, they're going to do what they're going to do. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is because whenever we get up in our family, our neighborhood, our company, our community, our country, we have a choice to make. We can speak the truth, or we can speak lies. We can use our words to divide people or bring people together, to hurt people or to help heal to spread fear or to spread hope. I mean, we get to choose. No matter what other people around us are saying or doing, we get to make that choice. And so one of the things that I hope people take away from the book is that, do good. As you say, be a force for good. Use your words, your rhetoric, your language for good, for bringing people together, for inspiring people, for, as opposed to dividing people.
Good speakers are speakers who do good. You talk about in the book. And now you said that one of the most powerful things we can do is to end with hope. There's another super powerful thing we can do, and it's one of your last chapters. And that's one of the chapters that made me cry. You talk about the importance of telling the truth. So when you speak, always tell the truth. Again, for those who haven't read the book, can you share some ideas around that?
Yeah. So I think, if I had written a book about public speaking communication maybe a decade ago, I'm not sure I would have devoted a whole chapter called Tell the Truth. But we are where we are in the world, and so many leaders, so many people on social media. It seems that we have lost a shared sense of reality, a shared sense of objective facts. And the reason I wrote this chapter is again, we can't control what different leaders say and do, but we can make a choice as speakers, as leaders. And I think one of the lessons that I hope people take away from this book is, when you get up, we should all make a resolution to tell the truth. And so I lay out kind of 10 commandments for telling the truth, things that we can do when we speak to make sure that we are rooting our presentations in fact, in evidence, in the truth, especially for young people who spend so much time on TikTok and social media and aren't sure what they're seeing is true anymore. I try to share some resources. There are these wonderful things called books and encyclopedias and libraries and fact-checking organizations and newspapers that have fact checkers. There are still things that are facts or false, and it's our job as both consumers of information, but also as producers of information, to make sure that we're always asking, am I telling the truth today? And there are gray areas. I admit that, and I talk about how to navigate some of those gray areas. And we had this at the White House. We as speechwriters would, before it ever would go to the president, we had a whole team of fact checkers at the White House, and their job was to kind of rip our speech apart and to make us defend every single word, every single number that we had in there. And sometimes the feedback we got would be drive me crazy, because our fact checkers, these were our friends. They might say something like, well, what you've written is factually true, but. And as a writer, I'm thinking, well, if it's factually true, this conversation's over. There's nothing left to discuss. Their point was, it's factually true, but it might lead some people to conclude X. And I would say, well, I didn't say X. And if they're going to erroneously conclude X, then that's on them. And their point was, well, no, as communicators, we should be as precise as we possibly can. Remove any doubt, remove any confusion. So they're saying there's a way to be more precise here. So working with fact checkers changed the way that I write and the way I think. And I try to share some of those ideas in this whole chapter, all the different ways that we can tell the truth. And it's hard. And sometimes I include some examples where speakers have been booed by their own supporters because they told the truth. But in the end, we have to make the decision about what's important to us. And so I hope people will take this chapter to heart.
Excellent.
I hope a lot of leaders read it too.
Yeah, that's a good point, because this is not people thinking about you, Terry, and your work, your background. Some people may think that this only applies to politicians. It's not the case. This is for anyone who needs to use their voice to communicate something, and hopefully to do good with their voice. And it could be anyone, including, especially, I would say, from my perspective, business leaders, entrepreneurs, business owners. They also have, of course, they have a responsibility to tell the truth.
Think about, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there are individuals who have lost their jobs as CEOs or as business leaders. Sometimes they go to jail because they don't tell the truth. Now, in the legal realm, they have all sorts of fancy words for it, right? Like fraud, misleading investors. But it all comes back to they weren't telling the truth to their employees, to their colleagues, to their investors. So there are profound consequences when we don't tell the truth. And every few days, it seems, or we hear of a company or a leader who has tried to be too cute, or has misled investors, or misled the public, or misled regulators. It never ends well. It never ends well. So, tell the truth because it's the right thing to do, but also tell the truth because it's the smart thing to do. It's in your self-interest to tell the truth.
Yeah. Before we conclude, a couple of final questions. And this one, if nothing comes to mind, that's totally fine, Sarah. No problem. We can also edit it. If you think about what we talked about today, all things speech writing, public speaking, communication in general, any books that you would recommend to our listeners beyond, of course, your own one, which I highly recommend? Say, well, it's, as I said at the beginning, one of the best, if not the best book I've ever read in this space. Any other resources by any chance?
Yeah, I did read. I did go. Finally, before I wrote mine, I did read a handful of other public speaking communication books because I wanted to sort of know what the landscape was. I didn't want to be repetitive, and if there were stories or ideas that other people have covered, I didn't really feel the readers needed to hear them a fifth or sixth time. One of the great books about public speaking. So I was by another White House speechwriter, Peggy Noonan, who wrote for President Reagan. Obviously, I don't share her politics, but she wrote a book many years ago called "On Speaking Well," and it's her tips and her perspectives on how to be a great communicator and great speaker. So I think that one's out there, so I'd recommend that one. But there aren't a ton out there by folks. I believe the book I've written is the first one in about 20 years by a presidential speechwriter around this topic, and so I hope people find it useful. I hope people, obviously, if you want to learn how someone like President Obama became the speaker that he did, I tell those stories in the book as well.
Yeah, so many stories in the book. And if anyone wants to connect with you, say hello, for example,
Right.
learn more about you, your work, where do they find you, Terry? Where should they go?
Well, two places. One is I'm on LinkedIn, Terry Szuplat, and every day I try to, LinkedIn's like one of the last nice places on the internet. And so every day I try to share public speaking and communication tips and lessons and strategies. So anyone who wants to connect with me, I'd love to be connected with you and try to share what I've learned every day. And then otherwise, my company is called Global Voices Communications. If anyone's ever looking for this kind of support, I offer it as well, Global Voices Communications.
I'm going to include everything in the show notes. And let's close with this, Terry. Have I missed something important? If you think about what we've discussed, if you think about the ideas in your book, also your experience as a speechwriter for Barack Obama, is there a question that you think I should have asked that I didn't? Have I missed something?
No, but one question I often get is people say, well, is being a good speaker, a good communicator, is this are people naturally gifted, or is it a skill you learn? And you mentioned how you don't believe anyone's naturally gifted. That's a huge theme of the book, because I don't believe anyone's naturally gifted public speaker, or frankly at anything. I always tell people when you see someone at the top of their game, whether they're an athlete or a musician or a performer or a public speaker like Barack Obama, and you think that they're naturally gifted, well, no. What you're marveling at is the finished product. You're marveling at the result of years, if not decades, of hard work. And in the book, I tell a story of a young Barack Obama in his mid-20s struggling to give a speech one day. And I asked him how it felt, and he talked about how embarrassed he was. And I put that in there because I want people to understand that no one's great at this when they start. Everybody has to work better. I asked the president, how did you go from being that 20-something-year-old young person who struggled that day to being just a great orator? And he walked me through all the different things that he did to try to become better. And I include that in the book because I want people, especially young people, anyone who wants to be better to know that this is a skill, and like any skill, you have to work to get better at it.
Agreed, 100%. Terry, so thank you so much again for your time, for your generosity, for writing an amazing book, for taking the time to share your ideas here. I really appreciate it. Let's keep in touch.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a great discussion. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.